introduction, and well, thank you for being here and spending your evening with some critical self-reflection on the world of business and I guess on our own professions. So what I want to talk to you about are the 40.3 million people in the world that are actually slaves, that live in enslavement. And the way I got to the topic of modern slavery was actually through Kevin several years ago. And what I found really fascinating, or what fascinated me as a supply chain scholar about it, is that a lot of the principles that we teach students how to run a supply chain, how to optimize your operations, is the exact opposite. What you would hope they would sometimes do. So one of the things, for example, we came across was, if you have a risk in your supply chain, your standard response would be to diversify your supply base, diversify the risk, have a backup supplier somewhere else. What we saw with modern slavery is actually companies started having fewer suppliers. So have fewer suppliers, work with them more closely, monitor them more closely. But that again then raises another question about, does this cut out small and medium-sized enterprises from participating in business, because the onboarding cost for every new supplier has suddenly gone up because they have to put in so much more due diligence than before. So there's some of these sort of principles that we almost took as sort of established knowledge in supply chains suddenly were questioned. And as an academic, that's usually the gold nugget of research when you find these kind of problems that sort of contradict existing theory. And so when we look at 40.3 million slaves in the world, they are all over the world, and they're also pretty much in every supply chain. And I think you sometimes see companies guaranteeing a slavery-free supply chain, or wanting to sell you a stamp that guarantees that your supply chain is slavery-free. And I think we're now at a moment where we accept that that is impossible at this point in time. One of these slaves will be somewhere in your supply chain or in your labor chain that you use. You may have never seen them, you may have never heard of them, but they are out there, and it's a matter of looking hard enough to actually identify them and rescue them. And so the way modern slavery sort of came into the UK discussion was, well, I guess through two sort of main storylines. One is around car washes, and I hope you've seen some of that in the news, where it's predominantly migrant labor that's being exploited to work in car washes all around the UK. But also you've probably seen stories around the Qatar World Cup that's still to come, and in the construction of the facilities for the Qatar World Cup, already thousands of workers have died for our entertainment that we will enjoy during the Qatar World Cup to come. So these would be migrant workers from places where they cannot find better employment, so they would go to Qatar and work under very hard conditions. And there were actually British companies who were holding some of these contracts, of course in joint ventures with Qataris, to deliver the construction for the Qatar World Cup. So there's surely more to come out of the Qatar World Cup, and how they will be trying to make happy games out of that situation will be probably an interesting marketing exercise. So these mega sporting events that we see around the world actually have, from that experience, started to think much more about the social sustainability, the labor that's required to build facilities for us that we all use. So what is actually slavery? So when we think about slavery, there's always the first problems around sort of definitions, and of course academics love definitions, right? So that's always our first starting point. And I don't know how many Christmases in a row I had this debate with my dad, where he would say, your brother, you know what, he's a corporate lawyer. He works 80 hours a week. It's like, well, that's not slavery, right? That's really well paid. And also, he could walk away at any time and get a better job somewhere else, right? So this is not about having a terrible job or not enjoying your job, right? It's quite far away from that. And so the way we think about modern slavery is actually there's a spectrum of labor exploitation. My brother is not on there, don't worry, okay? So we're looking at labor exploitation as a spectrum, and it starts somewhere with not paying someone the minimum wage or not giving them the right safety equipment. And then at some point you end up with a slavery-like condition where somebody is enslaved. And of course, when you speak to business practitioners, it's sometimes quite difficult to say, well, is this legally now a situation of slavery, or is this just a really terrible situation? And my advice would usually be, well, if you go into a supplier's factory and it makes you worry whether this could possibly be slavery, it's already bad enough, right? So you should already be doing something about it, even if it's legally it might not be slavery quite yet. So there's this wider spectrum of labor exploitation, and one of the problems we get into in a short moment is different legal systems actually apply slightly different definitions of slavery. So the legal term of modern slavery is not internationally harmonized yet, and that makes actually running a global supply chain even more difficult, because getting prosecuted for slavery in Brazil means something different to being prosecuted for slavery in the UK, because there are different definitions of what slavery actually constitutes. Has everybody watched 12 Years a Slave? Yeah? Okay. If you haven't, I don't know if it's on Netflix at the moment, but my colleagues from the history department tell me it's actually a very accurate reflection of slavery in the southern United States at that time in history. And that is very often how we initially conceptualize this concept of modern slavery. But actually modern slavery is quite different. So we are not looking necessarily for somebody who's chained up on a cotton plantation. Modern slavery uses a legitimate interface that makes it look like a normal business relationship. So the concept of slavery is outlawed anywhere in the world, even in North Korea. So as a slaveholder, you had to find new mechanisms to actually enslave people, because you don't have that legal title over another human being. So you can't claim that legal ownership. So we're using economic mechanisms. And so the typical ones would be, for example, debt bondage, where somebody is getting a loan, but that loan is structured in a way that they can never ever repay that loan. So they will be kept in that debt forever. And if they wanted to move, well, they need to find somebody who's taking over the debt from the current debt holder. So that is they're de facto enslaved in that mechanism that makes it look like there is a financial legitimate transaction between them. Similar things we find with contract slavery. So where people are often brought to the UK or also in other countries, they think they're going to go into a legitimate work relationship, but then actually there are all sorts of charges deducted from that worker, and in the end the worker ends up with almost nothing or with nothing. And of course, if they wanted to leave that situation, there are mechanisms of control over that victim. So whether that's violence, rape, or psychological ways of controlling that person. So it's a situation that you cannot leave in a safe way. And actually, when being from the Midlands, one of the places where slave labor was found was the major distribution center of Sports Direct. And when Mike Ashley refused to actually see the select committee, and then he was ordered to attend, his excuse was, well, I wouldn't know because I come to work in a helicopter, so I don't see what's going on there. Because I'm the captain of the ship, I don't know what's going on in the engine room. Which is quite interesting, particularly for those of you who work in the retail industry. Your national distribution center is your nerve center. You know, every retailer knows what's going on in the national distribution center. It's just a matter of, do I actually care how these people are being treated in my national distribution center? So if parcels weren't delivered to customers, they would probably care about that, but they don't care too much about how the workers are being treated. So what we've seen all over the world is actually a range of new pieces of legislation against modern slavery. One is the UK Modern Slavery Act, which is currently undergoing a review because we've seen that many mechanisms in the Modern Slavery Act are not working as strongly as we were initially hoping for. So the UK Modern Slavery Act requires every business with a turnover of more than £36 million to produce a Modern Slavery Act statement signed by the directors put on your website. And if your statement says modern slavery, so what, I don't care, as long as it's signed by your directors and put on your website, and you do that every year, you're legally compliant with the law. So it doesn't require you to do anything about it, it just requires you to report on it, which is a weakness that I think we see quite a lot of evidence for when we actually go on websites and look at companies' modern slavery statements. The other thing is there's no penalty. So even if you didn't even produce that statement, there's no penalty. And one of the quite interesting aspects of the Modern Slavery Act, the public sector itself excluded itself from the Modern Slavery Act. The Modern Slavery Act only applies to commercial organizations with a turnover of £36 million. Some public sector organizations voluntarily included themselves, but the public sector doesn't necessarily fall under the Modern Slavery Act, which of course is a problem if you are operating a business in a sector where you have a high demand from the public sector. There are other modern slavery legislations. The Australians have just started a Modern Slavery Act, which is sort of an improved version of the UK's Act. The French have put it into the duty of care law, so it's a due diligence requirement. In the US, it's actually in the trade law, which is also why very often it is perceived in developing countries as a non-tariff trade barrier, and not necessarily as a sort of sustainability enforcement tool. And actually, as I mentioned, Brazil has it actually in the penal code and has a very strong modern slavery definition that also includes exhaustive working hours and degrading conditions as modern slavery. And actually, Brazil maintains what they call a dirty list. So if you've been found to have been using slave labor, you've been placed on the dirty list, and it means you cannot get government financial investment support, and also many large corporations would not award you any contracts anymore. So, which is a very confrontational way of doing it, but also, of course, quite powerful from an enforcement perspective. So, businesses now are being faced with all these new types of legislation, and of course when you're running a global business, different geographies will apply their own piece of legislation. It's not necessarily harmonized. And well, what is sort of the natural response of a business is audit. Okay, so let's send people into a factory every 3 years, and then we send them 3 years later, and they just either keep finding the same things or they just get better at hiding it. But what we also find is that some companies are actually engaging with suppliers in a quite meaningful way, and very often that is actually a very educational approach. So it's not a zero tolerance approach where you ditch a supplier instantly when you find a violation, but it's often an approach where you go and educate, where you go and develop suppliers. If they are unwilling to improve, yes, of course, at some point you go and find a different supplier. But it's much more actually rebuilding relationships in a supply chain that very often before have only been run at sort of more of an arm's length. And so one of the projects we've just been working on is actually on a comparison of the beef and the timber supply chains in Brazil. And just to give you an example of how difficult it is to challenge modern slavery in your supply chain, if you're a beef producer, you would usually run sort of a slaughterhouse, meat packing facilities, and then if you're one of the global players, you would export it into foreign markets. And of course, you need to get your cattle from somewhere. Right? So if you are one of the largest beef producers in the world, you need 20,000 animals per day to keep your supply chain run efficiently. Right? So if you don't get enough animals, your operations are not as efficient, which means you're losing money. And you would source these animals from around 70,000 farms spread all over a country that is just huge. So, when you think about our usual corporate mechanisms of auditing, supplier monitoring, maybe a bit of risk scoring, that's really, really difficult in that reality. And also, their relationships with these suppliers is actually very short term. It's a spot market. So there would be a price that you're willing to pay, and the farmers would call you up and say, well, I'm willing to sell, or they don't call you up. So it's a very short-term relationship. Whereas, of course, in what we see, for example, in timber, it's a much longer relationship. So to grow a tree takes about 7 to 14 years, depending on the species, until you can sell it. And so you would usually agree 50% of the price at the beginning of the time period, and then you're being paid through installments throughout the time, and then the final price, the other 50%, is based on the spot price on the day, when the tree is sort of ready to be harvested. So you have a much longer term relationship. And we are only now getting into sort of an understanding how supply chain specific it actually is to have a modern slavery risk. So if you're thinking about you're working for one of these beef companies, your challenge is a very, very different challenge than if you're running timber plantations and maybe a paper mill with around 2,000 suppliers that are all around you and that you have a much, much longer relationship with. So the bad news is, I guess, is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It seems to be getting very actually supply chain specific, understanding your supply chain. And I think some of it is actually rebuilding relationships. So what we've seen over the last decades is this globalisation, where supply chains get longer and longer, more complex, more and more actors involved all over the world. And this disconnect between the producer and the consumer that has happened. And maybe this is now a time where we actually see the reverse, where these supply chains may have overstretched, where companies are suddenly getting worried that they actually don't really know where their stuff is coming from. And actually suddenly consumers start holding them responsible, and maybe at some point legislators will hold them responsible for what's going on in their supply chain. So this concept that we outsource business operations to a supplier and we outsource all the risks that come with it to that supplier too, I mean, that's an unbeatable business model, right? So this idea of actually having a joint responsibility, not just morally but also legally, for what is going on in your supply chain, I think that is something that will be quite interesting how that develops over the last years. Because if we as consumers and voters think that there is a moral responsibility that you have for what's going on in your supply chain, at some point the law and the opinion in the general population need to be, or should be the same. Well, should be. Doesn't always apply in politics. But there needs to be an alignment between the two. So yeah, I think what we will see is probably some stronger regulation, a lot more expectations on professionals to actually work on modern slavery, but also on other ethical issues in their supply chain and being held responsible for them. And one thing I really like about the little devil there is it actually pretends that a business is this just one thing. But a business consists out of many people who every day make very junior or very senior decisions. So I think modern slavery is a topic where businesses are not just, they're not the problem. I think we all as business professionals are actually part of the solution. So this is not about thinking that we are all criminals because we engage in business activities and we consume things, but it means by engaging in these activities, we also have a responsibility for actually challenging modern slavery that is going on. One website I would like to direct you to as a homework, right, because you're attending a lecture, is actually a website called slaveryfootprint.org. And it doesn't work particularly well on phones, but it will work okay on your computer and on your tablet. It will ask you even further uncomfortable questions than the ones that were already asked earlier. And in the end, it will give you a score how many slaves you are personally responsible for as a consumer. Please send me an email if your score is 0, because definitely need you to give a guest lecture. My personal score is 38. So I would class myself as an ethically conscious consumer. My score is 38. Yours might be lower or higher depending on how you consume. But I think it gets us back to that point that slavery at the moment exists in pretty much all supply chains, and it's a matter of us challenging it rather than pretending that it's not in our supply chains, it's just in somebody else's and it's somebody else's problem. Thank you very much.